Thank you all for joining Political Research Associates today for a roundtable discussion on Christian Zionism. Today we have quite a few people who may be new to Political Research Associates. PRA is a national nonprofit entering its 40th year. We provide research, analysis, and strategy recommendations to understand and combat anti-democratic forces. By exposing patriarchal and racist movements, PRA defends a vision of feminist multiracial democracy. I would like to begin today by introducing PRA's Executive Director, Tarso Luis Ramos, who will be setting the stage for our discussion today. Tarso, take it away.
Thank you, Koki. First, I'd like to thank our guests today for joining us. We're honored to have Peter Beinart, Professor of Journalism and Political Science at the City University of New York. Peter is also a contributing opinion writer at the New York Times, a CNN political commentator, editor-at-large of Jewish Currents, and a non-resident fellow at the Foundation for Middle East Peace. We are likewise honored to welcome award-winning racial justice and civil rights activist, Linda Sarsour. A seasoned community organizer, Linda is the former executive director of the Arab American Association of New York, co-chair of the Women's March on Washington, and co-founder of the first Muslim online organizing platform, Empower Change. Linda, Peter, and myself are joined by my esteemed colleague, Stephen Gardner, Assistant Research Director of Racial and Immigrant Justice here at Political Research Associates, and the author of our recently published piece, End Times Anti-Semitism, Christian Zionism, Christian Nationalism, and the Threat to Democracy. Peter, Linda, Stephen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Koki, before I turn this back over to you to moderate, I'd like to set just a little context for PRA's interest in hosting a conversation about Christian Zionism. At PRA, we study anti-democratic movements and ideologies in order to strengthen the work of social justice and human rights movements. Our mission leads us to focus on the US political right as we pursue research of strategic value to movements pursuing social justice and charting a course towards genuine, multiracial, religiously plural feminist democracy. Those familiar with our nearly 40-year body of work will know that we confront white supremacy, anti-Muslim racism, anti-Semitism, Christian nationalism, misogyny, authoritarianism, and related matters. In our work with social justice movements, we often find that exposing hidden or underexamined actors and strategies on the right can lead to more powerful social justice coalitions and strategies. It's in that spirit and with these hopes that we invite today's discussion on Christian Zionism as a critical yet seemingly underappreciated obstacle to justice, peace, democracy, and human rights. So why are we concerned with Christian Zionism and why talk about it now? My colleague, Stephen Gardner, will do some of the heavy lifting on these questions in just a minute. For now, I'll introduce our topic by way of a short story. I was struck during my first and only trip to Israel-Palestine a couple of years ago with the Center for Constitutional Rights at how many of our hosts, journalists, human rights activists, whether Jewish or Palestinian, expressed alarm at the inordinate influence of US right-wing evangelicals on both US policy and more directly through missionary and related projects. I was not surprised exactly. The oversized role of Christian Zionist ideology and strategy, which is anti-Muslim, anti-Semitic, and implicitly aligned with more theocratic and authoritarian arrangements in Israel and Palestine, is something that PRA has examined going back 10 years or more. On our website, you'll find articles about Christians United for Israel, Pastor John Hagee, and the powerful theological reasons Christian Zionists want an expansive Jewish state. It's more that I was struck at the contrast between the characterization of the exercise of US power I was hearing in Israel and Palestine as compared to the relatively scant discussion of the role of US evangelicals in debates here in the US. There are exceptions, of course. The embassy relocation decision and ceremony drew a lot of commentary, but not, as far as I'm aware, any significant adjustment and assessment or strategy with respect to Christian Zionism. So at a moment of perhaps peak influence of the Christian right over domestic and foreign affairs, this simplified, if ubiquitous, narrative of Jews and Arabs or Muslims fighting a seemingly irresolvable conflict in the Holy Land is badly distorted, yet awfully convenient as a narrative, for the Christian right anyway, which largely escapes notice as a leading antagonist, even as it has both progressive Jewish and Muslim movements in its crosshairs. Also, as a minister's kid, it seemed only appropriate that I should take some responsibility for calling out the atrocious behavior of a Christian right movement that is simultaneously driving a racist, misogynist, and theocratic agenda here in the United States. So we have modest goals for this webinar to offer an explanation of what Christian Zionism is, why it's significant enough to warrant our serious concern and response, and to begin a discussion with remarkable leaders and strategists, our guests today, about where a proper appraisal of Christian Zionism might lead us. Finally, before turning it back to Koki, I'd like to acknowledge that today, the 27th of October, is the second anniversary of the Tree of Life synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh, a violent attack that took the lives of 11 people, and a sobering reminder of why PRA is dedicated to exposing and strategizing against anti-Semitism and anti-immigrant racism in our work. With that important note, I turn it back to our capable moderator, Koki Mendes.
Thank you, Tarso, for contextualizing our conversation today. And thank you, Linda, Peter, and Stephen for joining us for this important discussion. So I'll get us started with our first question. As a research and strategy center focused in large part on countering Christian nationalism and white nationalism, Stephen, can you talk us through how Christian Zionism fits into PRA's framework of analysis of the US right and provide a brief explainer for those of us who are less familiar with the movement?
Hi, thanks, Koki, and it's great to be here today. Yeah, I'll try to be brief. I'll do my level best and just be quiet after a couple of minutes wherever we get to. So at PRA, we look at the right, the political right, the cultural right in the United States as an ecosystem of movements and organizations and factions that are not always aligned with each other. They come into conflict, but around certain issues, policies, and political leaders, they tend to have some points of common interest, or at least common investment in outcomes, whether that's around securing the borders or confirming a particular Supreme Court justice or maintaining quote unquote law and order. These things are connected. Within that ecosystem, Christian Zionism, as we see it, is a theologically grounded ideology that acts as a kind of political glue. Now, I'm not suggesting that Christian Zionism is the only factor, for example, around which, say, Christian nationalists come together. Far from it. Nor is it the only factor in shaping U.S. Israel policy, Israel-Palestine policy. Far from it. But it holds a particular place that we're interested in drawing attention to, partially because there's more influence there than is oftentimes perceived, and also because it's a place in which anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, anti-Semitic, and anti-democratic tendencies come together. So, yeah, I mean, to try to summarize Christian Zionism in a few words is difficult, but I'll give it a shot here. For definitional purposes, Christian Zionism is a movement among certain Christians, mostly charismatics and some evangelicals, who use theological justifications to justify, to support not just the modern state of Israel as it exists, but a particular version of that state that is both expansive and has little or no room for the inclusion of Palestinians. So a few points then to keep in mind. So from the hardcore of Christian Zionist leadership, Israel should have whatever expanded boundaries the Christian Zionists believe is part of the world historic mission of theological mission of Israel to bring about the end times. Of course, it's not the mission that most Israelis have, or that most Jews in the diaspora have, but it's the Christian Zionist view. The temple has to be rebuilt on the Temple Mount, regardless of political and human consequences. Jews in the diaspora should move back to Israel, and in the places where they're living now, particularly in the United States, they really ought not to be made too comfortable, because that might encourage them to not move back to Israel. CUFI, or Christians United for Israel, the largest politically oriented lobbying, Christian Zionist lobbying group in the United States, tries to obscure this fact, but it sees this process of sending Jews back to Israel as a part of a end times conversion experience, where a few relative small percentage of Jews will convert at last to see the light of their particular version of Christianity, and the rest will be in in not such good shape. These ideas are motivated, of course, by lots of practical concerns, but also by a couple of theological points. One oriented towards prophecy and the role that people like John Hagee see for a particular version of the state of Israel in creating the context for a second coming of Jesus, and at the same time also a secondary theological idea that is viewed far beyond the confines of Kufi as a kind of spiritual economy of curses and blessings that goes back to Genesis 12:3, where God says to Abram, I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you, and all the families of the earth will be blessed through you. Repeated elsewhere in scripture, this basic idea says for Christian Zionists that the United States, in order to avoid being cursed, must support not just the state of Israel, but the particular state that Christian Zionists imagine it should be. So that's some of the basic sort of theological background. The other thing that I would mention is that the Christian Zionist lobby is strong enough to mobilize hundreds of thousands of people to send postcards and messages to the White House to support something like the U.S. embassy relocation to Israel, and that at some level of political belief, a very large proportion of evangelicals in the United States, so we're talking about tens of millions of people now, and a large percentage of the population of the United States has an orientation towards this idea of Christian Zionism. They may not be fully cognizant of all of the strategies, but the thing is, when you have a small core who for whom it is a complete litmus test, they can, in a sense, and have, in a sense, wagged the dog on the rest of the evangelical community, the same way that, say, the anti-abortion movement has wagged the dog on the rest of the right, so that now anti-abortion is a plank in the Republican Party. And finally, I would say that in the last few years of the current administration, we've seen movements like Kufi track even harder to the partisan right, to the Republican right, for support, as the symbolic gestures and the rhetoric and the appointments of Christian Zionists, like the vice president, our election of the vice president, appointment of the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, has alienated much of the opposition, the Democratic Party opposition, from the kinds of unresistant, limitless support for the state of Israel in any form, as opposed to looking at Israel as one more potential ally of the United States. And that's, I think, where I'll leave it for the thumbnail sketch. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. It's not an easy task summarizing a theological and political project in a few minutes, but we appreciate you setting the context for us. I'm going to continue actually with a quote that you wrote in your most recent piece. The Christian Zionist logic that calls on the US to unconditionally support Israeli policies simultaneously reinforces the adversarial stance towards the Muslim world that has been on display since 9/11. Linda, your opposition to Christians United for Israel and Christian Zionism is well known. Where have you run up against the movement in your work organizing against anti-Muslim bigotry and Palestinian erasure? And do you think the power of Christian Zionism is paid sufficient attention to in conversations and organizing work around Palestine, Israel, and the Middle East more broadly?
Thank you, everyone, for having me here today, and for PRA, and thank you, Stephen, for laying that out. I just want to be very clear. I'm not an expert in Christian Zionism, but I have been at the receiving end of the backlash and the political influence of Christian Zionists when it comes to the conversation about Palestine. I have, of course, as many of you know, have protested at Kufi conventions, and I've actually organized at their conventions. I have had the experience of being in the lobby and staying at the same hotel as Kufi attendees and having conversations and specifically targeting people of color and Black people from some of the churches, big Black churches, trying to really understand what is it about, what is appealing to them about this convention, like what makes someone who is a member of a marginalized community in America align themselves with these, what I believe to be probably the largest oppositional group that we have in the United States in this modern time, at least now, and really have had interesting conversations where people don't really even understand what Christian Zionism is, and even the ideology of how distorted it is, and how not only is it, at least in my opinion, just really like, I don't know how to explain it, but it's just actually not, it just seems like the people are not well, like that you believe that a whole group of people has to go somewhere in order to fulfill some sort of prophecy that you have is just beyond me, and the comprehension that even is a belief. And so a lot of people don't understand what Christian Zionism is. One of the things that has concerned me in particular is, of course, the Donald Trump administration and the influence that Christian Zionists have had, and had a little, I mean, they still had influence before, but really been very emboldened under this administration. And the work for us, and I know this is going to sound really controversial, but that's who I am, and probably why Tarso brought me here. There's sometimes you got to find the blessings in things that are evil. And one of the things that has been for me seen as some sort of light at the end of the tunnel is that because of the influence of Christian Zionism and their alignment with the Trump administration, and then the alignment of right-wing Jewish Zionists with Christian Zionists and the administration, the American people, and a lot of people who didn't really understand Palestine, Israel, didn't know which side they were on, it became very clear, you're either on my side or you're on the side of Donald Trump. And so the actual influence from the progressive perspective is that we've gotten a lot of more intersectionality and solidarity around the issue of Palestine, Israel, based on people watching the Hagees of the world, going all the way to, Israel, to Jerusalem to see the moving of the embassy. And then at the same time, connecting groups like the ADL. So you have Hagee, who's a homophobic, racist, anti-Muslim, anti-women. I mean, I could sit here days listing the horrificness of this man and the ways in which he speaks about marginalized people. And then watching someone like Jonathan Greenblatt from the ADL, who also goes to celebrate the moving of the embassy, and then finding people who claim to be civil rights leaders and part of civil rights organizations who are supposed to be, defending Jewish communities in the United States of America, aligning themselves with Christian Zionists who are in fact antithetical to civil rights and to marginalized people. So that has been my experience, that I've received the wrath of it, which is fine. But because of that, the progressive movement has been able to see kind of the exposing of Christian Zionism, its heavy influence, and put people in a predicament where you just got to choose whose side are you on. And so I'm, seeing for me, it's like it's actually helpful that Donald Trump was able to align himself, or the evangelical Zionist, Christian Zionists aligned with the administration, has been really helpful to the Palestinian solidarity movement.
Thank you, Linda. Peter, I'm going to turn to your expertise next. When most people think about growing right-wing anti-Semitic movements in the US, they think of white nationalism. What do you see as the anti-Semitic threat posed by Christian Zionism? And in a time when the Israel-Palestine debate is stronger than ever within the American Jewish community, do you see growing awareness of the threat posed by Christian Zionism as well?
Thanks. So I guess I would say, just to follow Stephen, I think it's important to say that not all Christians who define themselves as Zionists are what we would define, at least in this conversation, as Christian Zionists, which is to say that Reinhold Niebuhr was a Christian who also considered himself. John Lewis, to some degree, was a Christian who considered himself a Zionist, was comfortable with the Jewish state, and was not influenced. You could agree or disagree with them on various policy issues, but I don't think they were influenced by a kind of end times theology. So I just think it's worth underscoring that. I think also it's important to say that not all anti-Semitic threats stem from Christian Zionism or even white nationalism, right? Anti-Semitism is a peculiar ideology that can find expression in a lot of different places. Louis Farrakhan is an anti-Semite. He's not a white nationalist. The Hamas 1988 charter, which talked about the protocols of the Elders of Zion, was anti-Semitic, and they're not a white nationalist organization. However, I do think that by far the greatest anti-Semitic threat in America today comes from forces associated with white nationalism. And I think the reason is fundamentally that bigotry against Jews is deeply intertwined with bigotry against other groups. And so in an environment in which bigotry against African Americans and immigrants and Muslims and certainly Palestinians has been normalized, it's not surprising that that bigotry would also wash up on Jews, that we are interconnected. And I think what happened in Pittsburgh is a really perfect example of that. This guy in Pittsburgh, was not initially focused on Jews. He was focused on the supposed invasion of the United States by asylum seekers and people seeking to immigrate from Central America. But because he was a racist, he fell into this familiar trope of believing that these Latin American people could not organize themselves. And therefore he looked for a kind of a hidden hand. And that's where he turned to the Jews, to George Soros and ultimately the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. He shot up that synagogue because they had done a program with Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. And this plays into, I think, the peculiarity of anti-Semitism, which is to say that the myths of anti-Semitism often portrays Jews as kind of sinister geniuses. And those anti-Semites who see Jews as sinister geniuses also are often racists who have a different stereotype of Black and brown people, which is that they are inferior. And so that's why during the civil rights movement, you saw so many people saying that Jewish communists were running the civil rights movement. Of course, they weren't running the civil rights movement, but these people were bigots who didn't believe that Black Americans could run a movement themselves, so they looked for a hidden Jewish hand. In South Africa, it was very common for the South African government to say that Joe Slovo, a Jew born in Lithuania, head of the South African Communist Party, head of the ANC's military wing, was running the ANC, not Nelson Mandela. It was nonsense. He wasn't running the ANC, but it was a feature of the racism towards Black people and the anti-Semitic stereotype of Jews, again, as kind of sinister, evil geniuses. So you see how this comes together in Pittsburgh when this guy comes to believe that it must be Jews who are actually running this migrant caravan. And I think the lesson there is that we as Jews, for reasons of our own self-interest, in addition to what is just morally right, and I believe stems from the best of Jewish ethical tradition, have to stand in solidarity with other groups that are threatened by white nationalism. Because if there are those in the American Jewish community who are tempted to try to make a separate peace with white nationalists because they support policies on Israel that some American Jews support, or because they are willing to define American Jews in certain circumstances as white. And I think what Pittsburgh shows is that ultimately it's not only a betrayal of our own best traditions, but ultimately it threatens our safety.
Thank you, Peter. Stephen, before we move on, do you want to jump in and talk a little bit about the philo-Semitism you touch on in your piece as it relates to this question?
Sure. There's okay, first of all, I completely agree with Peter that when we're talking about Christian Zionism, we're not talking to people in the liberal theological tradition who have been motivated essentially by an effort to make amends for the long history of Christian anti-Semitism. We're talking specifically about some Christians, and even some Christians who, in some sense or another, support Israel, or some version of Israel. But the philo-Semitism, this is found on display in the Christian Zionist world for a variety of reasons. One, it goes back to that economy of curses and blessings that I was talking about. And so there are Christian Zionists who try to learn Jewish ritual in some form and incorporate it into some of their activities, feeling again that this will help them to incur this blessing from Genesis. They also use forms of organizing for missionary work, where they sort of disguise themselves in forms that make themselves look more Jewish, more Hebrew, by changing the various names of typical Christian ideas into Hebrew forms. But ultimately, they're still looking at this end times type scenario, or at least at trying to convert Jews to become quote unquote messianic Christians. And then finally, two things can be true at the same time. You can both have some positions that appear on the surface to be, and in a sense maybe even are, philo-Semitic in one part of the to one part of the Jewish world, while acting as judge and jury for in the United States the bulk of Jews who, from the point of view of most Christian Zionists, vote the wrong way. I mean, as simple as if you're not voting for the Republican Party, and particularly for someone like Donald Trump, then you are a traitor. You are doing the wrong thing as a Jew, and we as Christian Zionists know this because our prophecies and our understanding of the world tell us that. And of course, Donald Trump picks up on this in perhaps a more ham-handed way when he says, when he refers to the Prime Minister of Israel as the Prime Minister of American Jews, which of course for Jewish American citizens, it's completely untrue and insulting. So yeah, I mean, that would be my short version of that kind of shell or facade of anti-Semitism, of philo-Semitism that is, from my point of view, maybe 1 or 2 parts out of 10 true and the rest false when you start ticking the boxes.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you all. I think we've got a good establishment of what Christian Zionism is and your interpretation, your reaction to it. So I'd like to turn to thinking about the political consequences of this movement. Tarso, as you mentioned in last week's webinar on misogyny and authoritarianism, or 2 weeks ago, we are now seeing a third wave of authoritarianism with anti-democratic regimes in the Philippines, Brazil, Belarus, Poland, Hungary, the US, to name just a few. Can you talk us through the authoritarian implications of the end times agenda?
I'll see what I can do, Koki. We are, as you say, living through a third global wave of authoritarianism. The first produced mid-century fascism, right, including Nazism. And the second was epitomized by military dictatorships, often propped up by the United States or the Soviet Union, the sort that my family fled from Brazil in the 1960s. And we're now in a third global wave, as you say, including some of the countries you named. Trumpism is both a manifestation, of course, accelerator of that. Netanyahu seems eager to be part of the emerging global autocrats club, even if it means cavorting with anti-Semites like Hungary's Viktor Orban. So this is part of the global moment that we're living through. And while the history of Israeli-Palestinian conflict is, of course, not remade by the current wave of authoritarianism, its history is intertwined with the first and second waves. And this new global wave inevitably reshapes the context of all current contests for democratic self-governance. And so it's worth bringing in a bit into this discussion. And so I'll try to draw some connections in this way. The current drivers of rising global authoritarianism include, I'm not going to explore them all, religious nationalism, one, with theocratic movements, and secondly, racial and ethnic nationalism. Demographic change, climate catastrophe, economic inequality are also huge factors. But defining the nation, the people, in ever more exclusionary ways, to the point of advancing the idea of ethno-states, is a prominent feature of the current authoritarian discourse and policy, and it's not the first time that that's the case. And so here in the United States, as elsewhere around the globe, it's becoming increasingly clear that we must choose between authentic multiracial democracy or some version of exclusionary, expulsionary authoritarianism. Israel-Palestine have a different history, of course, in the United States, yet Israeli separationist authoritarianism is now part and parcel of this global wave of autocracy that we're witnessing, which just perhaps creates a possibility of re-envisioning Israel-Palestine within a global anti-authoritarian movement grounded in a vision of safety and solidarity under multiracial democracy, rather than separation and domination. That's perhaps another discussion, pardon my preoccupation with authoritarianism. To your question, among the drivers of increasingly authoritarian arrangements in the US and in Israel-Palestine is the power and influence of US-based Christian nationalism and Christian Zionism. As Stephen points out in his piece, End Times Anti-Semitism, and he's spoken here so far more about the theology than about the power of Christian Zionist movements in the United States. Stephen says, we're seeing explicitly Christian Zionist organizations and megachurch pastors working with high administration officials like Mike Pompeo to justify expanding support for a right-wing authoritarian Israeli government as the fulfillment of prophecy. The closeness of that relationship is a real problem, and it won't simply go away, even if it's been accelerated and amplified by Trump. It won't simply go away if there's a Trump defeat. So I do wonder if this presents some opportunities for realignment and strengthening of pro-democracy forces across religious and racial ethnic communities here and there. And I was struck, in fact, Linda, by some of your comments about how organically some of that has already begun to happen because of the association of Trumpism in its various expressions, including its autocratic expressions, with how folks entering into politics now are reinterpreting the nature of the conflict and the stakes and the possibilities in Israel-Palestine. I think that's to be expected. We are in a different global context, which both amplifies threat and creates perhaps some new opportunities. And I do wonder about the opportunity of focusing on Christian Zionism is a overlapping concern across multiple constituencies, often pitted against each other, and that don't necessarily see themselves pulling for the same outcomes or having the same vision for what a more liberatory democracy could look like, whether in the United States or elsewhere in the world.
Thank you, Tarso. I think PRA would be remiss if we did not touch on authoritarianism at least once per webinar. But Stephen, before we move on, can I ask you to speak a little bit more about the influence of Christian Zionists in the Trump administration and the policy outcomes of this influence?
Yeah. Okay. So it's been pointed out already that we have high-profile Christian Zionists inside the administration, including Vice President Pence, Secretary of State Pompeo. We have high-profile Christian Zionist ministers like John Hagee and Robert Jeffress, who are close to that administration. They're the ones who are called on to do dedications, not just at the not just at the embassy in Jerusalem, but to come to the White House and do consultations and to regularly comment on U.S. policy in places like Fox News. Jeffress, for example, has vast influence that the Trump administration is clearly interested in mobilizing. He is heard on over 1,000 television and radio stations in the United States, for example, and is pastor of the First Baptist Church in Dallas, which has 15 to 20,000 members. But of course, Christian Zionism isn't the only influencer on on Trump administration policy towards, say, Muslim bans and border walls, and as well as Palestine-Israel policy. What I would like to say is that the increased focus on placating Christian Zionists within the Trump administration has created a situation where the Christian Zionists have a outsized profile even within their own right-wing evangelical circles, at least amongst those evangelicals who are not abandoning Trump. Some are at this point, but it's still the vast majority by all polls who are one of the two core constituencies for the Trump administration, the other being ethnic nationalists. But I put it like this in terms of the way Christian Zionism works in this circle. These are the people for whom they are the single issue voters who will reject any candidate who won't support the kind of Israel-Palestine policies that they want, and therefore they, in creating coalitions of evangelical voters and influencing them, they're going to have an outsized influence. And the analogy I would use is if you take the way in which, say, economic libertarians support attacks on public spending and the public good, there are a relatively small number of people, but have an outsized influence because of their intense focus on that one issue, spending on the public good. Whereas like a big constituency that will get on board with that, say the anti-immigrant movement, who are there not because they think spending on the public good is evil, the way libertarians do, but because they think spending on the public good will, by chance, benefit brown people, and they don't like that. So there's this common ground that is held together by the glue of the ideological coherence among the libertarians, and so we get a $3 trillion tax cut.
Thank you, Stephen. Now I'd like to turn our discussion to Linda and Peter as people who think about Israel-Palestine a little bit more than we do here at PRA. As evidenced by our discussion thus far, Christian Zionism is particularly influential in this current political moment and is a factor in the election next week. What are the implications of Christian Zionist organizing for the establishment of a way forward for Palestine and Israel? Linda or Peter, I'd like to open this question with either of you, whoever would like to take the first.
Okay. Look, I mean, the kind of Christian Zionist worldview is one that I think has little room for Palestinian humanity. It's a storyline in which Jews are these figures that are supposed to play this kind of this role in Christian theology. It's not Jewish theology. For instance, mainstream Jewish theology has been very clear for 2,000 years that Jews should not seek to rebuild the Temple Mount, for instance, and the prohibitions against that in the Talmud are very strong. But on the one hand, Jews are these central characters who need to play this role in dominating this territory to fulfill a certain theological vision, and Palestinians are completely erased and dehumanized, which essentially means carte blanche for the state of Israel or the United States to do whatever it wants to them, and that I think is truly chilling. We've seen. I mean, I think continually struck by the ability of people to have this deep connection to this land and this imagined place, and yet think so little and care so little about 50% of the people who actually live in that territory, right? 50% of the people between the Mediterranean and the Jordan are Palestinians. I always think, don't you believe that God put them there for a reason, right? If God didn't want them there, God is powerful enough that they would not have been there. So they're there. So therefore, their rights, their humanity, their dignity matters too. This is unfortunately something I think can be forgotten both in certain elements of the American and Israeli Jewish community and among Christians as well. And so I think that our challenge as Jews is to say, you may feel that you're doing this on our behalf. You may be sincere in your belief that you want the best for us, but we have a different ethical tradition. In our ethical tradition, the Torah does not begin with Jews. Adam and Eve, Noah, these are not Jews. These are universal human beings and created in the image of God. And all human beings have inherent and infinite weight. And therefore, Palestinians do too. And their rights and their dignity and their humanity are as weighty as the weight of Jews, no more and no less. And if you don't see that as Christians, then in a certain way, you don't actually see us, because this is the best of our ethical tradition. And we don't want to be partners with you in dehumanizing and erasing and brutalizing Palestinians.
Thank you, Peter. I think, you know, for me as the Palestinian American who's here and has family who live under the military occupation by the state of Israel, and also family who live in Gaza, in the largest open air prison in the world, it's important for me to put some context forward. I know this conversation is about Christian Zionism, but I am an anti-Zionist Palestinian, and many Palestinians are anti-Zionist. And my work, particularly with many progressive Jews around this idea of the aspiration of Zionism to be a safe and secure homeland for the Jewish people, is not something that I take lightly. And I understand history, and I'm a student of history. And I think it's important that we got into a moment now in the larger progressive movements where even some of our Jewish friends who always proclaim being progressive Zionist are having their own complicated conversations within their community and with themselves. Because the reason why I'm an anti-Zionist is because I do not believe that any nation state can exist and build a safe and secure homeland for one people at the expense of another. It just doesn't, it's not part of my solidarity framework. It's not part of any human rights framework. There is no way for one people to be liberated at the expense of another people. And the thing that troubles me in the larger movements that we're a part of is that alignment sometimes between people who may be centrist, I'm not going to say progressive, you know, but even for folks in some of the Jewish communities that find themselves oftentimes in places with people who do not care about their best interests. In fact, people who are in fact a threat to their safety and security. And I've had this debate publicly, privately. I've had this on college campus where I would tell these young Jewish Zionist kids on campus, I said, listen, if something bad were to happen, the first people who would be on the front lines defending Jews in this country would be people like us, would be our solidarity movement, would be the movement for Black lives. It would be the Palestinian solidarity movement, because this is part of our ideology and the ways in which we organize. And so for me, the thing that has really, I think, disrupted our movements to even build stronger movements is that Christian Zionism in of itself has been very divisive because it has been reinforced by some right-wing Jews. So the movement gets confused. They said, okay, so we get these people are not well and they're not good, but how do these people stand with these people in a space that really, for me, is probably one of the most dangerous spaces for any Jews is to be amongst Christian Zionists. And I know that people want to make nuances, and there's a lot of nuance, but in the larger Palestinian solidarity movement and in the larger Palestinian community, we don't have nuance. Zionism for us was the displacement and the disposition of Palestinian people. And in order for us to move forward and to figure out how to reconcile and to understand Christian Zionism, to understand right-wing Zionism, and just to understand Zionism in general, it has to include people like me to be part of a conversation about why is Zionism something that we see. And when we hear people say, and you know this, Tarso, in the movement, people say Zionism is racism, and that is immediately rejected. And then the question is not, I'm not asking people to embrace that, if they don't want to. I'm asking people to come to the table and say, but why do people believe that Zionism is racism? When I think about our domestic policy, and I'm in the movement, and I'm often very perplexed about how we can say that we are against the ripping of babies from their mother's arms at the border, right? When we are against the police brutality against Black people and Black people across the country, sometimes what we're seeing as the manifestation of domestic occupations of communities like Baltimore and Ferguson and Portland and Louisville, Kentucky, where I have been living, and then be against that and say that is outrageous. I'm going to the border and I'm against this, you know, the wall that is, you know, that the Trump administration is continuing to build on the border, and I'm against these things. But then I'm perplexed that we don't have the same opposition to the same exact things as the wall that we see that has separated Palestinian families, that has ended economic opportunities for Palestinians who live in occupied territories, the detention of Palestinian children with US taxpayer dollars, the lack of freedom of movement for Palestinians. I mean, even in occupied Palestine, it may not be an open air prison, but it is a prison in its own way. That, for example, as a Palestinian, when I go to Palestine, and I've been somehow lucky to get in at one or two points, to be able to live in, to be in Palestine with my own Palestinian family, and as an American be able to go to Jerusalem, but my family who lives in El Bire cannot go to Jerusalem. I mean, the thing is beyond comprehension. And so I wanted to bring that into this conversation, because I don't want anyone to walk away thinking that Christian Zionism is the problem and the only problem that we have in the conversation around Israel-Palestine. The right-wing Jewish Zionists who have aligned themselves with Christian Zionists and in fact empowered and emboldened them in this administration is for me what makes it even a bigger threat. And it makes it a bigger threat to Jews. It makes it a bigger threat to solidarity and progress in our progressive movement. It has divided us. You can watch the whole controversy around the Women's March. The Women's March was the largest manifestation of mass mobilization that this country had ever seen in like 25 years, at least 30 years. We had never seen anything like that. In fact, up until today, the Women's March on Washington is the largest single-day protest in American history. And the kind of semi-dismantlement of the Women's March on Washington was at the hands of Christian Zionists and right-wing Jewish Zionists. I mean, that was the whole controversy around the Women's March, was the weaponization of anti-Semitism, and without giving any opportunity for conversation and nuance. And the people that fueled that were also sometimes progressive Zionists who unfortunately fell for the weaponization of anti-Semitism against some of the most effective organizers that we have. So I think the conversation is a lot more complicated for me as a Palestinian than just Christian Zionism as one singular entity or a singular ideology. It is complicated. It's mixed with the white nationalists. It's mixed with right-wing Jewish Zionism. And then the policies, to the question you asked, Stephen, when I think about this administration changing the definition of anti-Semitism to include criticism of the state of Israel, to try to go after organizations like Amnesty International and Oxfam, that is very troubling to me. You know, having an administration that has, you know, targeted curriculums in places like California around teaching about Palestine from the perspective of Palestinians and boycott, divestment, sanctions, the criminalization of boycott, divestment, sanction, or the movement to criminalize it is also often supported by groups like the Anti-Defamation League, which is supposed to be part of the quote unquote progressive movements that we're a part of. So for me, I'm saying all this in you know, different, you know, trying to tie some thoughts together, because for me, it's been a very challenging conversation and not really finding the way to move forward, because it seems to me that this issue of Israel-Palestine has really held the progressive movement back in ways that are detrimental to all the issues in the marginalized communities that we all care about.
Thank you, Linda. Peter, I invite you to respond if you'd like. You're muted.
Yeah, there's so much in what Linda said. I think I would start with this. It is really, to my mind, absurd to expect Palestinians to be Zionists or to not expect them to be anti-Zionists, given the experience that most Palestinians have had in their own families with what the Zionist movement and then the Jewish state has meant for them. And that's why I have, you know, even in Jewish spaces where it's not very popular, I have repeatedly argued against the conflation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Are there anti-Zionists who are anti-Semites? Sure. There are also Zionists who are anti-Semites. These two things are, you know, Arthur Balfour, who signed the Balfour Declaration. You know, I know Jewish people who are literally named after him. That guy was a big anti-Semite, right? He didn't want Eastern European Jews to come. He supported the 1905 Aliens Act in Britain that stopped Eastern European Jews from going. He wanted Jews to go to Palestine because he didn't want them in Britain, right? Which is an old story, right? The Polish government in the 1930s was pretty anti-Semitic and pretty Zionist as well for that same reason. I think that oftentimes when Jews and Palestinians talk about Zionism, they can mean different things, which is, I think that for many Jews, Zionism is about a safe place for Jews. Now that doesn't mean that that one shouldn't have arguments about Palestinian rights and Palestinian equality. I myself, you know, have argued that I believe that In fact, there is a dissonant Zionist tradition, a cultural Zionist tradition, which starts with the Chad Ha'am and continues with people like Martin Buber and Hannah Arendt and Judah Magnus, that would actually say that you could be a Zionist, meaning you could believe in the importance of a thriving Jewish community in Israel-Palestine, in a state of complete equality, in which everyone lived under the same law, in a state that treated Jews and Palestinians equally. I don't think it is right to exclude Jews who call themselves Zionists from progressive spaces, just as I also fundamentally oppose excluding anti-Zionists from progressive spaces. I think the critical thing is for us to look carefully at what exists on the ground, to look at the history of both of these people, and to understand and I think no one of the writers who've done this, I think few have did it better than Edward Said, who was able to hold the idea of Zionism as a movement that had many settler colonial features, and yet also even able to write out of the enormous pain and righteous indignation that he had as a Palestinian, to understand why, given the Jewish experience, there would have been so many Jews who saw this as a movement of refuge, even though Palestinians understandably saw it as a movement of colonialism. And I think the challenge is to try to hold those two things. And then the challenge is to try to make people reckon with realities on the ground. And I think one of the tragedies for me, which is, I think is true for many Christian Zionists, but is also true for many Jewish Zionists, is that as deeply as those people, some of whom are my close friends and people I go to synagogue with, et cetera, as deeply as they care about this territory, they often don't take the time to actually see for themselves and experience what Palestinian life under Israeli control is like. And I have just seen again and again that when people actually do that, it is a transformative experience, because I don't believe that any person of goodwill can go and spend any significant amount of time interacting with Palestinians as human beings who live with fewer rights than an African American in the segregated South, and think that that is not a tremendous moral offense that offends both our principles as human beings and, to my mind, offends the Jewish ethical tradition.
Can I just add one thing, Koki, to what Peter said? And I think just it's important, not for you, Peter, but just for clarification for folks that are on with us today. And I appreciate PRA for having this conversation, because it's something that I've been caught into. You know, our movements, and you know this, Peter, from being in some of these conversations, our movements don't have checkpoints. There is no checkpoint where someone says, show me your credentials, show me what your ideology is. I think what's important in the larger progressive movements and the thick conversations that we have is that we do not put preconditions on the spaces that we are in. So some of the controversy around Zionism within the movement is not about progressive Zionists are not allowed to be in the movement. They are just as allowed as everybody else. But being able to say, well, we can't talk about boycott, divestment, sanction, that certain types of pieces of social justice framework around Palestine being included in some of the work that the larger movements are doing cannot be blocked, for example. And you've seen the criticism around the movement for Black Lives from some folks who claim to be Zionist is very harmful. And it also puts a progressive Zionist in a predicament where it looks like the movement for Black Lives doesn't also stand against anti-Semitism, or doesn't stand for the Jewish people. And I think for me, my controversy has come from this idea that everybody's welcome into our space, but now our spaces are being led by communities of color, by also Black Jews and Jews of color, and folks who are directly impacted, not just based on their faith, but based on their race, based on their gender, based on their sexual orientation. And these folks are finding an intersectional opportunity to build power in a way. And in the movements that we're a part of, and something that I have preached for a very long time, is the idea that unity is not uniformity. And one of the things I invite people to the table is, you're going to sit at a table. Me and Peter will sit at a table together. And I'm going to disagree with Peter on things, and Peter will disagree with me on things. But there are still universal principles that we all share. And so what I say to a lot of folks in the movement who are, progressive Zionists, I'm anti-Zionist. I'm anti an ideology. I'm not anti-human beings that believe things that I don't believe. So you are welcome to our movement spaces. I think the point of contention becomes either you deciding to walk away from a table that has an issue on it that you do not agree with, when it has 9 other things that you agree with, like immigration and supporting immigrants and supporting climate justice and supporting racial justice and economic justice. And there's just going to be sometimes an issue where we don't agree. And I think that has been something that I wish that our communities would evolve on and our movements to evolve on, that we are going to be in spaces where we do not agree. But as long as you see as you said, the humanity of the communities that I come from, and that you also believe that Palestinians deserve equal rights and deserve justice and deserve to live with dignity, as I believe everyone in the world should. And my perspective also, and I saw you write this around this idea of a one-state solution, and you already explained what it is. There have always been Jews in that land. My grandmother was born in 1927. She told me many stories about Jews and the interactions that Palestinians and Jews had in pre-1948. And so it's not like Jews just came from Eastern Europe, you know, fleeing the Holocaust. They were there living with Palestinians for hundreds of years. So the movement right now talking about this idea of one state solution is not at the exclusion. It's in fact this idea of a multiracial democracy, a multi-faith democracy where we all live and can participate together in a way. And I think that is resonating with people. I think when you, and it was funny because I actually had made some commentary about a piece that you were, and I said, listen, Peter's saying some stuff that other people have been saying and I've been saying, but you know what, maybe when Peter says it, you'll all listen to what we have to say. So it does require courage of people like you, Peter. We've seen that starting to emerge amongst folks in this larger conversation on Israel-Palestine that has really brought us to a different place. And I think we only see moving forward from here, but being able to address the influence of Christian Zionism and the reinforcement of the political influence of Christian Zionism by right-wing Jewish organizations who will align themselves with people, again, who do not have their self-interest at heart. And I hope that our Jewish brothers and sisters see right through that and understand that it is us, the progressive movement, that are your allies. And it is us, the progressive movement, who are going to be the ones to defeat fascism and to fight against fascists.
Thank you, Linda and Peter. This is why we had you both on this panel. So it's wonderful to hear you two in dialogue talking about these important ideas. I want to come back to a strategic conversation, which we're starting to touch on. But first, we would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge the election in 1 week from today. And Stephen, I want to ask you, we talked about the Christian Zionist movement's influence in the Trump's administration. What if he fails to win re-election? What is the Christian Zionist influence beyond the scope of Trump's administration?
Well, I mean, this is a great question, and again, it fits into the ecosystem of the right wing in the United States, and so no, we never want to consider Christian Zionism in isolation, but the prominent role that Christian Zionists have had in making policy or influencing policy, even in the Trump administration, means that, and their ideological centeredness of the thought leaders in Christian Zionism means that post-Trump, if Trump were to lose this election and leave the White House and be replaced, and a new slew of officials appointed, you're going to see a massive backlash from the Christian Zionist world, which is going to use this as a way to raise funds, as a way to make really kinds of literally apocalyptic claims, saying this is the sign of the United States falling to the Antichrist, and we're about to lose our blessing from God if the next president doesn't continue with these same kinds of policies. Now, of course, it's important to recognize that the foundational foreign policy support for the state of Israel has been relatively the same across administrations, Democratic and Republican, now speaking about the economic and military support and viewing Israel as a strategic partner and as a sort of model for a way of conducting business in the quote unquote messy neighborhood of the Middle East. That's the right wing conception of seeing those people, those others, as being difficult and more deserving of being dealt with drones and bombs and aircraft carriers than diplomacy and being treated like human beings. So how much change is that going to be? Well, I mean, I think what we're going to see is a consolidation of various elements of the Christian right, including Christian Zionists, around this idea. Then at the same time, of course, there will still be continued support for the state of Israel from the of the particular form of the state of Israel that we now see at this moment, and the right-wing authoritarian administration that exists there. There is, however, potentially an opening. This is my hope. And this is one of the reasons why we want to talk about Christian Zionism, not because it's the only issue in play around US foreign policy in the Middle East, or foreign policy with respect to Israel-Palestine, but because it links American foreign and domestic policy. It links, it redirects attention to a part of the problem that involves mass constituencies, without ignoring the problem of the Jewish right, without ignoring the problem of the pragmatic and militarist or secular right. Focusing on Christian Zionism is one place, like focusing on white nationalism, where many constituencies can potentially have a strategic impact pushing back against the bad name that the Trump administration has given to a particular kind of give them anything they want attitude towards Christian Zionists. And that bad name opens a little bit of cultural and political space to put pressure on the next regime, the next Congress, Democrat or Republican, to take some distance and say, wait, the United States is playing a bad role, a role of making things worse in Israel-Palestine, and at the same time, we're allowing ourselves to be, our democracy to be eroded here by the influence of Christian nationalists, Christian theocrats, Christian dominionists, and within their midst, the Christian Zionists. And so they're not the only actors on the stage, but they're one we think that lots of people should be able to agree with. We can think about what they are for, and the way Linda put it, as with Trump, we ought to be against that. If you want to simplify it down to its most common denominator, Christian Zionists equals Trump, we should all be against that.
Go ahead, Peter. Did you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think that just to go back to something that Tarso was saying as well, I mean, I think we are it's a fascinating moment in the sense that there is a rising authoritarianism and ethno-nationalism that crosses geographical and religious and ethnic boundaries, and we've seen these coalitions emerging, right? I mean, it was this fascinating debate that Benjamin Netanyahu had with Barack Obama, essentially, when Obama basically said, listen, your way of seeing the world is outdated in the 21st century. The long arc of history says that basically you can't sustain these policies. And Netanyahu said essentially, really? Look at essentially, and has now said, look at Orban and Bolsonaro and Erdogan and Modi. These are my compatriots, and has now made peace deals with deeply repressive Arab regimes like the UAE and Bahrain, right? And so has assembled essentially a kind of an ecumenical, multicultural, authoritarian alliance. And I think it poses the question to those of us who don't share those values, can we do the opposite? Can we create a kind of multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious kind of coalition alliance based on principles of equality and democracy and freedom? Maybe the fact that all of these leaders have been able to come together around their shared values can make it clearer what those shared values are, and make it clear that in every society, in every country, you see this internal struggle. I mean, one of the reasons I think that Christian Zionists essentially like Israel so much, but are not always as clear they like diaspora Jews so much, is what they really like is hierarchy and homogeneity. Of course, Israel is not a homogeneous place, but they see it as a homogeneous place because they don't see Palestinians. And they like its hierarchy in which Jews have more rights than Palestinians. In some ways, that may see that even as a kind of a model for some of the hierarchies they would like to reimpose or to buttress in the United States that they feel like have been eroded perhaps in recent decades. And the problem with diaspora Jews is the diaspora Jews are a threat to American homogeneity, and they don't always line up in the ways that Christian Zionists want in terms of the hierarchies that the Christian nationalists and Zionists are trying to establish in the United States. They in some ways mess them up because here's this, population, most of whom seem white in a lot of ways, who are actually relatively economically privileged and yet don't vote for the Republican Party. 75% of Jews election in and election out essentially cast their lot with African Americans, with Latinos, with LGBT people, right, with Arab Americans, because partly that's our ethical tradition. And I think that's deeply vexing for many members of the Christian right who see it as a form of ingratitude. And so I think it means that there is, I think, to pick up on what Linda was saying, in this very, very, very frightening moment, there are also opportunities.
Thank you, Peter. That's a perfect segue into my last question before we open to audience Q&A. Linda, I want to start with you. From a strategic perspective, who are the actors that you think need to be thinking about, talking about Christian Zionism, and what's next for you in engaging this anti-democratic and influential movement?
It's a big question, Koki. There's so many forces that are opposing our communities and influential in maintaining the oppression against marginalized people. Christian Zionists specifically have never been, for me, a group that I've specifically looked at. I see them as part of a larger kind of white nationalist. I see them as part of the larger kind of nativist movement. I see them as part of the larger anti-women's reproductive rights. They are actually intersectional in their bigotry that they, for me, have never been. I never isolated them as Christian Zionists. I think it's a conversation that needs to be had in the larger progressive movement. I think someone was asking a really important question in the question and answer that's related to this, and something that I really want to reflect on more around, let's just say, for example, that the Biden administration wins. But people are not thinking about the potential influence that the Mike Pences of the world will have in a kind of newly formed Republican Party that's going to absorb a lot of these influential Christian Zionists, and what kind of resources will they have? What kind of, will they be the reemergence of a different kind of Tea Party movement and come back in 2022 and potentially even 2024? We don't know what their trajectory is. But what I do know about, Republicans, just watching the recent swearing in and nomination of Amy Coney Barrett and Brett Kavanaugh, they have a long game that they've been playing, and they've been playing it for decades. So we don't know because they are, sometimes you have to, be able to say the truth, which is they have been very strategic in isolating and consolidating power and influence and using and looking at the different branches of the government that they want to be in. And for them, the courts have been a very important place. So I think as we think about, politics in particular, and being able to build a movement, a political movement that's going to be able to withstand some of the future strategies that they will be implementing, even if they don't win the White House in the next week or two. I think having, PRA and maybe Tarso, we can talk about this more, about how this conversation can be integrated in some of the larger conversations that are being had in the movement around power mapping. I can't remember the last time I looked at a power mapping that said Christian Zionist on it. I think that there's different iterations, or maybe things that I could now interpret as maybe they meaning Christian Zionism, but there has never been explicit discussion amongst communities of color-led movement strategies that really specifically focused on Christian Zionism. So I see that as an opportunity. Even myself, as I said earlier, I'm not an expert in Christian Zionism. I came here more to share a perspective of a Palestinian American, because this whole conversation, those are the directly impacted people by the influence of Christian Zionism, particularly on Israel-Palestine. But I think it's a conversation that has not been had thoroughly within the progressive movements, and I hope that we're able to have that together.
Thank you, Linda. Peter, would you like to add to that at all?
I think let's go to the next question.
Okay, great. So we're going to do a couple audience Q&As. We probably only have time for one or two. Sort of stemming from what Linda just said, Tarso, a question for you. What are the organizing possibilities, period? And what are the organizing possibilities with progressive Christians, especially white progressive Christians, against Christian Zionists?
So one way into this question is to say that I think, in addition to power mapping and putting the influence of Christian Zionism in its appropriate place within an understanding of the forces arrayed against democratic possibilities in Israel-Palestine and its role within the Christian right in the ways in which it's arrayed against democratic possibility in the United States, there's also a question of what kinds of conversations are most useful for stripping back the facades of supposed democracy. We're in a moment in the United States now, for instance, where increasingly there's a sense that status quo ante, right? Just going back to what we ever had before Trumpism is not a response to racial justice, for instance, or economic injustice in this country and so forth. And that there are lots of illusions that people have had about the level of advancement or degree of democracy in this country, that a moment of crisis is compelling many folks to rethink and reimagine. I think it's worth asking what kinds of lenses on rising authoritarianism globally allow for folks to see with new eyes the failures of other systems. And I think that discussions about Christian Zionism are useful both because it is a power block that tends not to be addressed. One of the consequences of not addressing it, it seems to us at PRA, has been a kind of caricature of the fights that happen over Israel-Palestine policy, where it's Palestinians and Jews fighting, or maybe good Jews and bad Jews fighting in a particular way that obscures the role of other power players and brokers in this. And so it's useful to step back from those caricatures and to ask questions that allow folks to see, people to see with new eyes. In that context, it does strike me that the struggle in the United States that involves Christians who are against Christian theocracy, against Christian nationalism, and we see this even from fairly centrist to socially conservative folks. We see the Baptist Convention, launching an educational and organizing campaign against Christian nationalism. There is a growing awareness of the threat of Christian nationalism and theocratic movements in this country that is not confined to the progressive, left in this country. And there is potential power in that. So I do think that there is opportunity, just as there's opportunity to expand and remake, broaden some coalitions in the United States towards the end of real multiracial feminist democracy, in other words, democracy. I think there's also the possibility of expansive coalitions that think differently about supporting democratic possibility in movements abroad, internationally, including in Israel, Palestine, but not only there. This is truly a global phenomenon. Look, I was born in Brazil. I have Brazilian citizenship. My children have 3 passports, which sounds like a luxury. Only those passports are good in Brazil, the United States, and the Philippines. So take your pick. We can live with the president as death squad leader, right? And has accrued to himself unilateral capacity to ban the press in the Philippines, among many other things. We have a declared, aspiring military dictator, proto-fascist in Brazil. And we have in the United States, an aspiring authoritarian who is juggling these various factions, white nationalists, Christian nationalists, sort of economic libertarians of that sort of Koch variety, and trying to juggle them in a way that accrue to his own power, who ironically, for having one of the most powerful stations, on the planet, must be a great admirer of the political scales of of Netanyahu, who has imagined, looking ahead to this election, who has imagined managed against all the odds to avoid any kind of accountability and somehow, remain in power. I think this is in fact the model, right, of a kind of strongman leadership that's truly global. So I do think that there are new and powerful opportunities for multiracial coalitions for democracy in the United States that involve Christians, involve Muslims, involve Arabs, involve progressive Jews, and so forth. And that thinking and seeing through the lens of authoritarianism and peeling back some of the veneers of would-be democracies is a healthy exercise. It may be able to yield a different set of interventions, especially for a younger generation of activists who are coming of age or newly engaged in this political moment, that can get out of some of the ruts that we've been in freedom struggles and democratic struggles in the United States, in Israel, Palestine, in Brazil, and many other places, by reading the terms somewhat differently and setting our goals quite differently, and not settling for systems that call themselves democratic, but have within their foundational sort of DNA, right, the experience of governing colonized populations, whether they're colonized outside of the borders of the polity or inside the borders of the polity, or as in the United States, both, that provide the kind of technologies of racialized authoritarianism that are deployed in a moment like this to greater force, but that are inherent and always present in the system itself. We can do better, and I think vastly more people are drawn to a vision that calls on us to do better.
Thank you, Tarso. I think those are good words to close by. We have more than 20 questions I see, so I want to invite you all to stay tuned. PRA will be putting on a deeper engagement series around Christian Zionism. For audiences who identify as donors or philanthropists, but open to the public. So that's the opportunity to explore your questions with PRA in the future. Stay tuned for more information about that via email. Before we close, and if anybody would like to make any last statements, I know we have a message from a partner organization that we'd like to share. And Linda, Peter, if you have anything else you'd like to say, we've really enjoyed having you in this conversation today, and we really appreciate you taking the time in a very busy week to be here with us.
Thank you, Pierre. I mean, I think I would just say that I'm still a student. So I look forward to continuing to learn, to continue to have conversations. I think the more knowledge that we have, the more, it's actually not a cliche when people say knowledge is power, and knowledge is in fact absolutely power. And so I look forward to learning through PRA.
Thank you.
Likewise.
Great.
Thanks for doing this.
Thank you so much, all. Audience, we have another webinar in 2 days, same time. If you'd like to join in to talk about the election and what's to come, we'd love to have you. Thank you again, Linda, Peter, Tarso, Stephen. This has been a really fabulous discussion. Stephen, closing partner statement.
Sure. First off, thank you all for tuning in for this long and interesting, fascinating, but difficult topic in this difficult time. Thank you particularly to Peter and Linda for coming on and engaging on this topic. Our friends at FOSNA, Friends of Sabeel North America, are conducting a campaign particularly targeting CUFI. If you would like to find out more about that or to get involved, I would point you to them. They have great resources at fosna.org/counter-CUFI. And it's one place to plug in. Of course, there are many, many others. And I welcome you to get involved and to inform your resistance, as we say here at PRA.